So what was it like before DevOps? And what were the drivers that spurred the creation of the DevOps cycle? This fundamental change in the way software and even hardware is developed within a corporate IT environment. Well, in order to understand this, one has to have a clear appreciation of the way software has been produced in most organizations over the last 4 decades. And generally, this was done through a method called the Waterfall model or the project lifecycle. Now, most of you should have an understanding of this, especially if you've watched or attended any of my previous IT fundamental courses. And most of you will also know that it's being replaced as a way of working in many environments with methods such as Agile. Although there were definitely situations where a strict project lifecycle approach is still needed, Agile is of course encroaching in all areas where project used to be. But the reason why organizations are coming away from the project lifecycle approach is because it has, unfortunately, a number of innate flaws. And I need to make sure that you understand those thoroughly before we move on. So these flaws are critical, especially when it comes to surviving in a rapidly responsive technology environment, which we find ourselves in today. Without going through the whole thing again, so you can see this in other areas of the Masterclass portfolio, you can see that it actually looks great, this IT project lifecycle. It's very logical. It's systematic. The trouble is that it just isn't ideal for the pace of innovation and change required in today's fast-moving tech scene. And if your organization depends on software or IT systems that needs to be at the leading edge all the time, well then this definitely, as an approach, has its weaknesses. Firstly, what's very obvious is that project is a very sequential, structured method. This traditional classical waterfall model requires different groups of people to come in at different times, and they carry out their own particular role. They will pass on their deliverable to the person on the next stage. Your typical enterprise IT project can also last anywhere from 2 to 6 years. And that's a hell of a long time before we see an end result. So you can see that it all kicks off with this initial feasibility stage, where users give the IT department a very detailed and precise idea of what they want to see from a new software product. This is the way things were done in the past. Now, this was traditionally gathered by the business analyst in the form of a contract called the user requirements document. So once they've gathered all their findings, they would put it into the user requirements document. That feasibility study would have taken anywhere from six months to a year, possibly even 2 years. But eventually that document would be created, and this document would effectively serve as a contract or a design template for the end product. In effect, it would kick off all the other stages, including meticulous design, build, and finally the test and launch of this single mammoth big product with one clear overriding purpose: to satisfy the needs outlined in that original URD. Again, I'm hoping you can see that there are a number of characteristics in this way of working. Firstly, the needs are very tightly defined, and this is how it's been in project for the last 40 years. The spec is clear, but this results in big, infrequent launches of software products every 2 years, every 3 years, every 4 years. So this can't cope well with the changing needs of the market or the changing needs of the users. Its design was effectively set in stone at the very beginning. The users were often disappointed with the end product because essentially it was an obsolete product by the time it was launched, because of those huge timescales built into project lifecycle. Testing, upgrading, and tweaking typically was then an activity carried out on the whole software product. When the market changed or users became disgruntled, you had to change the whole thing rather than looking at small incremental pieces of the code. To make matters worse, the IT landscape of any large company is never a neat, homogeneous one. It wasn't designed by the same architect over those 20 years. It wasn't built, all the software wasn't built by one single development team. People came and went. Other companies were bought and amalgamated into your organization. Indeed, in most cases, the software landscape of an organization is one where it's a mixture of fairly new and old legacy software. It's one where your software will often be required to interact with other custom-built software and off-the-shelf software which you've brought in. This application layer that you're building as an organization will also often be built on proprietary operating systems such as Windows. So the key point here is that not only are there a myriad of software coming through your project deployment pipeline at any one time within an organization, but every single one of those software will also need to interact with other proprietary systems, maybe an SAP ERP system or an Oracle database system, and definitely something like a Windows operating system. And those proprietary big products, well, they're all out of your control. And what invariably happens over time is that there are changes that are imposed upon your software landscape by those external parties. Now, some of those companies could upgrade their systems every year, but occasionally those upgrades could be major and they will turn into big deployment projects. For example, such as a major Windows migration throughout your organization. Microsoft decide to upgrade their systems. You are eventually required to upgrade the operating system you're relying on. That's going to have to happen. And of course, that's going to have a tremendous impact on the software that is coming out into the organizational landscape. In other words, the huge software applications we develop will tap into and hang off of those other systems. All of which could mean that your own software also needs to be adjusted by factors outside of your control. So software development, in other words, is forever in a state of flux. Now, there is where we left it in the other masterclasses in terms of the reasons for coming away from the project lifecycle. But now I kind of want to add the other element to this picture for you to understand, and it is this: that in an organization with a project mentality, like we've just been discussing, the end product is finally handed over to this team called the operations team, the support team, who will then maintain it for the duration of its life. And that's typically where operations departments kick in. More importantly, this environment over the last 40 years has resulted in a culture where you have got these two distinct and isolated teams of people. We call them silos in IT. So we have these two silos called development and operations that have just evolved through this process. One of these teams was seen as the very clever, creative programmers, and they would be brilliant at knocking out large, complete, and fully functioning products after a certain amount of time. Once they had done that, they would lose interest in that project and they would get excited about the next one in the pipeline, focusing all of their energies in knocking out yet another work of art. It was like a long, arduous process of giving birth and then passing that baby on to the operations team, who would then forever nurture it, deal with its tantrums and all the issues that the software would throw up for the duration of its life. So in project, we don't see a result until the end. There's just one big bang result, and it often is a letdown. There is no benefit during the process of software production, no benefit at all from the small incremental efforts that are put in by those developers. So it's all or nothing. The delivery is all at the end. If you did go back a year later to check up on that product, a very interesting thing would happen. The operations team would have a very clear understanding, a detailed understanding of the weaknesses of that product. Because they were the ones taking calls from irate users. They were the ones who knew that the software always seemed to fail for some reason on a Friday afternoon. They were the ones who knew that certain search queries by the users failed miserably when they were linked to a particular data source, because there must be some weird anomaly within the code. But because operations and software people have no clue about coding, and because they're so distinct and isolated from the dev department, there is no communicating this stuff back to the developers. Something that would have definitely helped had there been a pathway of communication. Future software developments could benefit from the experiences of the operations team. Conversely, this project environment has historically created an environment for friction, finger pointing, and even animosity between the ops and development teams, each blaming the other for the flaws of the system. And of course, this is where Agile came in.